Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just before we get started, I want to let you know that this session is actually going to be recorded because ETAQ's trialling a new system so that the regional members who can't be in Brisbane for the sessions can still partake in it. So we've got technical aspects happening over here. We just want you to be assured that if you speak, your voices will be heard. However, it's only going to be Di's lovely face. It's going to only be accessible for ETAQ managers, and it will be hidden in the depths of YouTube. So we just wanted to give you that warning. And I believe it's happening for the next session as well, isn't it? Yes. So everything technical is happening here. Now that we've got that out of the way, we are all honoured to have Di Laycock, who has decided to join us from the other side of the border. We were just discussing that. She very bravely decided to come into Queensland territory.
Not at all, we won.
Without having too much ridicule. Excuse me, Di is a full-time teacher librarian, and it's escaping me which school you're from right now. Barker College. And from what I understand, you're doing your Masters of Education with graphic novels as your focus point in the classroom. Is that your doctorate?
Yeah.
Yes? Did I say Masters?
That's
Apologies. Apologies. So I think we have the expert in the field with us today to share her findings of graphic novels in the classroom. If we can all welcome Di today.
Okay, thank you very much. The technology doesn't quite extend to the fact that we haven't got a clicker. We do have a clicker, but it's a human clicker. So thanks, Kelly, for being the clicker. So if you sort of see me going, yes, that's what's happening. So look, thanks very much for having me up here, and I really love every opportunity I can to talk about graphic novels in the classroom. And it was great to hear Catherine and Michael this morning, because I think so much of what I'm going to say about graphic novels as popular culture, etc., just sort of resonates with what we said about them. So in probably about the next 45 minutes, I'd just like to, a bit of a mashup. I'll have a bit of a look at the codes and conventions of graphic novels, what they are, etc. And then I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about some of the findings I've had in my research. Now, of course, you can't summarise. I'm still doing my doctorate. I've been doing it for 5 years. You can't summarise that in, let's say, 20 minutes. So I'm going to sort of paint those findings in very broad brushstrokes. I'm certainly not trying to say generalise from them. I'm just saying this is the experience of the teachers that I talk to, and I'm sort of hoping that it'll resonate with you. And I think Catherine was talking about, hearing teachers' voices. And I think when you hear teachers' voices, you get that messiness of the classroom. It's all very well to talk about why we should use graphic novels, etc. But what are the other things impacting on that? What's the messiness of the classroom, the organisational constraints that actually you need to consider if you're going to take them into your own classrooms? So, excuse me, I do need paper just to keep up to date, make sure I don't leave half of this out. So, as you can see, visual knowledge is certainly has a fairly important position in the Australian curriculum, and it's one of the sort of elements or organising elements under the general capabilities in the literacy thing. What do you call it? The literacy
General capability.
General capability. Thank you. Had a brain drain there. So I know we're English teachers here. I'm actually not an English teacher. I have a history background, which I think in Queensland is a social science background. So therefore, I'm not actually going to try and fit graphic novels into the various elements of the Australian curriculum. I figure you guys are probably much better at doing that than I would be. But what we can take from this is that we all have a responsibility to sort of help students understand visual texts, have the sort of toolkit, etc., to be able to decode them and make meaning, and also to produce them as well. So I guess that's why I put all subjects, all grades, and it's all our responsibilities. I guess when I turn the page, that's sort of the hint.
That's a good one,
isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. There are many sorts of text that we could use to facilitate the development of visual literacy. Computer games is one of them up there, which we had this morning. We've got things like hypertext. graphic novels. Now, I see those three in particular as sitting on the outside, on the fringes of sort of what we might call school-sanctioned literature, for various reasons. But I think that situation is changing. I think, not sure about the Queensland English syllabus, but the New South Wales does, at the moment, does not explicitly talk about graphic novels. There's not one mention of it. It's more about multimodal text, which is right, of course, but people tend to fall into the ones that are more familiar with picture books and with film, etc. And I think, I'll talk later on, a couple of my participants said it's that silent nature that's given to these sorts of texts. That teachers tend to think it's not legitimate, or it's, you know, the others are more legitimate than the ones that aren't mentioned. So I talk about these particular ones really as being on the outer fringes. I'm going to just look particularly at graphic novels. There's really nothing about graphic novels that isn't controversial, and that comes down to the name itself. So there are lots of, there are some people who will say, I'm not even going to use the term graphic novel. Neil Gaiman, who is one of, I guess, the most well-known graphic novelists, for example, he doesn't call himself a graphic novelist. Will Eisner doesn't call himself a graphic novelist. They like to call themselves comics creators. So comics being the broader medium, and then I like to think of different formats within that medium, but I'll go there in a minute. So Neil Gaiman once said, you know, being introduced as a graphic novelist was sort of like being a hawker who's introduced as the lady of the night. It sort of legitimised his craft. So graphic novel is, I guess, generally accepted, and certainly in education, if you read sort of books about using them in the classroom, it tends to be the preferred term. And my research participants, all of them, I actually asked them if they use the term comic books, and they all said, no, I wouldn't. I use graphic novels because I'm trying to convey to my students that these are complex and sophisticated texts, so it gives them some sort of academic integrity. So I'm defining here a graphic novel as a multimodal text, of course, delivered on paper or electronically. It communicates a complete and extended narrative through juxtaposed sequential art. Now, each of those elements is important. All the different formats in the comics medium have that characteristic of juxtaposed sequential art. So that's really the defining element or characteristic of comics. I've added in the delivered by paper or electronically. I guess I could actually extend that and say, well, do we include Aboriginal rock art that's or Indigenous rock art that's drawn on stone? But I guess for the context we're talking about in the classroom, paper or electronically are probably the two main forms. In the past, some people defined a graphic novel on the basis of what sort of paper is it printed on, is it bound into a book form, etc. So the fact that you now get web comics, graphic novels electronically, that sort of renders that particular definition obsolete. So that's really why I've included the delivery platform in my definition. That they have a complete and extended narrative. Now that's what actually separates it from, I guess, the comic books, the Supermans, the Phantoms, etc., that we might be familiar with, you know, the flimsy sort of publication. So you've got the whole story there, and also that's juxtaposed sequential art. And I'm going to just look at each of those particular things. I'm not going to yet. Yes, I am. It's all right. Sorry. Let's go back to the very first part of the definition, that they were multimodal texts. And Catherine talked about this morning, or she said the same thing in the gaming, that they are a text. I probably have to argue with Catherine. I often talk about graphic novels as the holy grail of literature because they do have these 5 semiotic systems in them. I guess we have to put gaming probably at the same level as that, so maybe there are 2 holy grails of literature. So, you know, if you read some articles, some of them will talk about it. It's the purest form to teach visual literacy because you just have such wonderful examples of each of these systems. And Burmark actually talks about visual literacy as being the primary literacy of the 21st century. So it really is important to have students engage with multimodal texts. classroom. To communicate these modes, we need to look at the codes and conventions of graphic novels. And certainly when I was talking to my participants, so I will sort of tell you a little bit about them in a minute, the one thing they really weren't comfortable with was the meta-language of graphic novels. And that applied even to the younger teachers who had sort of been born and bred on, a diet of Tintin and Asterix and things. They still found they struggled in the classroom when they really needed that, I guess that extra level of sort of language to be able to make that deeper analysis than when they were just sort of reading them for enjoyment when they were children. So if we can just have a bit of a click. Yes, thank you. So the particular codes, I haven't got time to go into them in great detail. On the handout that you've got, the one with the book descriptions, book recommendations, down the bottom, there's a website there called Graphic Novels 2D. It's hosted by the Australian government, the West Australian government, and it has got some details on these particular codes. It's got some activities, etc., and explains them really well. So if you have a look for the details of that. But you've got your written codes. So the written codes in graphic novels are things such as the speech and thought bubbles, the type of font you choose, how big it is, the style, whether you use lower and uppercase, all those things need to be read and to be made meaning of. You've got your technical codes, your angle, your line, your shapes, point of view, your panel shapes, page layout. And then you've got symbolic codes such as the colours, the relationships between people, objects, body language, clothing, and setting. Now, not all of these are specific to graphic novels, and certainly the teachers I spoke to were able to draw on the work they were doing with picture books, with film and other illustrated texts to help them with the meta-language, but there were certainly things like the documentary, speech bubbles, all those sorts of that are unique characteristics in the comics medium. So there is a very specific language that teachers and students need to have. So conventions, we're talking here about the accepted way in which we read things. Just as we have an accepted way of reading a print text, top to bottom, left to right, you'll be familiar with comics and you'll know that that's not going to work. So it's important to sort of talk to students about how the reading craft is, how the reading path is crafted, put together, and what to look for in terms of how to read a graphic novel. Now, I'm confining myself just to, at the moment, what I call Western comics, as opposed to the manga, to the Japanese comics, because if you looked at those and tried to read them with the Western reading path, you'll notice that it's not going to work, because number one, you're at the wrong end of the book, and number two, you're starting on the wrong page. So we'll just stick to Western comics, and that's another, I guess, consideration if you're bringing them into the classroom, depending on, of course, on what your students' interests are, what's their cultural background, whether you are going to complicate the issue by bringing in the manga. So the first of these particular conventions is we're going to look at is closure. Now, often we have people say, I'm not giving people graphic novels or comics because there's no room for your imagination left. Well, there's just in these two panels here, there is lots of, you are required to do a lot with your imagination, drawing on your previous knowledge and experience. So, for example, closure is all about closing off what we can't see. So we do have, two men's heads. Well, we've made that assumption already that they're men. Be very scary looking women, I suppose. We're assuming that they have the rest of their body with them, that they are human beings and there is something else. So we're probably in our mind, working out what they look like. We're also, not only are we working out using closure within the panel, we're using closure between the panels. Because between the left-hand panel and the right-hand panel, something has happened. All right, so we are actually closing that story by saying, well, what has happened? And perhaps we're all going to close it quite differently. we might be creative and say, well, there was some huge struggle and the guy at the back lost control of the axe and the guy at the front's taking it. Now he's the person pursuing. You know, there's a whole lot of different scenarios. So that whole idea of having to use your imagination, and Scott McLeod, who's written a fantastic book, which if you're ever going to, when you are going to use graphic novels, would be a great starting point, because it just so clearly talks about the codes and conventions, and it's written as a graphic novel. So, but he actually talks about the reader being the silent accomplice in putting the meaning there. Okay. In terms of the reading path, you wouldn't do this with every page you came across in a graphic novel, but it's a good exercise just as a one-off with students to actually have them look at something and talk about how the page was created. Graphic novels are a very economic sort of text. You have to get so much meaning. Like one graphic novel page might summarise, 10 pages of writing, perhaps, in terms of what people look like, what the setting is, what they're doing, passage of time, and all those sorts of things. So I remember going to a workshop once by a fellow who wrote or created graphic novels, and he actually said every line on that page has to communicate some sort of meaning. So here are some of the ways in which a person who's put a graphic novel page together well will make it so that the reader doesn't have to work too hard to work out how to read it. I mean, that's not the aim. You are wanting them to get the story that's being told, not I'm sitting here trying, I guess it's a bit like, reading a second language. You want the reading of it to be as easy as possible. So here are some of the various things that can, a bleed is where you have something bleed into the next panel, flow over into the next panel. So there's some of the techniques that can be used to bring draw your eyes' attention to various aspects on the page. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I talked about teachers being concerned about being fairly uncomfortable, not being terribly familiar with the meta language. And one teacher in particular summed it up by saying, we're doing a massive disservice to what's called the I generation, which sort of, considering everything now is an I thing, I thought the I generation was a nice term. And we're doing a massive disservice to them if we don't actually provide them with the toolkit to unpack these visual texts. All of the teachers, and you'll see on this handout about how they actually, the teachers in my study used the graphic novels in their classroom. All of them, bar one, explicitly spent quite a considerable amount of time on the meta language. The one who didn't was teaching a high ability class, and she said, look, I wanted them to work it out for themselves. Whether that is going to work, I'm not quite sure, but I wasn't actually looking at why she did that or whatever. She just said, I wanted them to work it out for themselves. The kids did actually have problems later on. They got confused about things, and I'm really not going to try and say it was because they didn't have the meta language, but that thought had to come into my mind. She said if she'd taken another class that she thought weren't able, she certainly would have spent time with that meta language. But if we can just jump back to our definition, the whole idea of the juxtaposed sequential art, that is really what distinguishes your comics medium from some of these other ones. So your film, your picture books, just your single cartoon. And it's because having the sequentiality and the juxtaposition actually moves the action forward on the page. So it's sort of like a movie on a page, I guess, if you'd like to say it. But as with the movie, it's sequential, but it's not juxtaposed. You're seeing one frame at a time. You would have to rewind the movie or fast forward it to see what's happening before and after. Whereas in the graphic novel, you can actually do that. You can go back and read that, and you can move forward easily. So if you look at these other three text types, they are lacking one of those two things, either the juxtaposition or the sequentiality. Now, I talked before about the graphic novel being a complete and extended narrative, and that really distinguishes it from some other formats within the comics medium. So if we remember comics in general, and I'm not I'm using comics here as a description of a medium, not as an abbreviation of comic book, which sometimes leads to confusion as well. So if we're remembering that comics are sequential juxtaposed art, then you've got some different formats of that. And the fact that we're sort of differentiating them on the basis of like techniques and things is why most people concerned with graphic novels, and we'll talk about them as a format, not a genre. I see actually there was another workshop talking about what's a genre and what's not, and I thought, oh, I really would like to have gone to see what she had to say. For example, in our school library, we've just, if it's such a term, genreized our fiction collection, and we did it on the basis of what is this thing about, not on the form of the text. So I think, students tend to think about genre, and most people talk about genre as having some sort of, I guess, thematic content. Would I be right? I'm not an English teacher, so please dispute that. But if you read the graphic novel literature, the comics literature, they tend to talk about graphic novels as a format, not a genre. So some of the different formats within the medium, you've got your comic strip, which is sort of usually somewhere between 5 and 9 panels. The fact that it is a short story, it is a complete story, but it's not an extended one. So that actually limits the sort of complexity and depth of the story that's told and the characters that are presented. You've got your comic books, your Supermans, your Phantom, etc. They're all using the same sequential juxtaposed art, but it's how they're doing it and what their purpose is to do it that distinguishes these. The defining characteristic or element between the comic book and the graphic novel is that comic books, you have to keep buying them to find out what happens. So they've got a continuity plot, whereas the graphic novel is the extended and a complete narrative. Now, of course, you'll find then that someone takes all the Superman comic books, I've slipped into it myself, comic books and puts them together and binds them, and then it becomes a graphic novel because it's now a complete and extended narrative of one story. So with any of these texts, and I'm sure in games and things, there's just this blurring of boundaries. You've got picture books these days that have got pages with sequential, comics art and all sorts of things. So I guess what I'm saying here is I'm really talking in sort of the purest form. I'm not, as I said, I'm not really going into the manga, things like Naruto, which sort of crosses over these conventions. They're bound texts. They're not complete narratives because, as you can see, Naruto there is up to number 28. I think today it's up to about 68 or something like that. Full Metal Alchemist is another one. They just go on and on and on. So that's one difference to, I guess, what we might call the Western graphic novels. But also, they're written for quite different audiences. They have distinct gender audiences. So there's manga for girls, there's manga for boys, and they're for different audiences. There's a lot of manga for adults as well. The Japanese, or the previous Japanese Prime Minister was always going on about the manga he was reading and all sorts of things. So I tend to think of that almost as a fourth format of the comics medium. Now I've confused you because I just flipped over 2 pages, but I only want to go to one slide. There is a sort of ever-expanding body of compelling literature and research that's being done on why we should use graphic novels in education. People started using the comics medium back in the 40s and 50s, and it was going on quite well for a while, and this is particularly in the United States. And then, of course, there was a Senate inquiry spurred on by a fellow who tried to make the link between reading comic books and juvenile delinquency, and I'm sure that has pervaded the gaming thing as well, that, violence and whatever. So they sort of went underground for a little while, and then they came back. But basically, I guess in the last 10 years, it really has sort of exploded in seeing the value of this particular format in the classroom. So it's not really, I guess people aren't really arguing any longer why we should use them. These are just some of the benefits up here. But how can we use them and what are we trying to achieve with them? On the handout, these are the participants in my study, and I've taken a little bit out of their unit programs and put it there of what they were trying to do with the particular graphic novel. And also just a comment from the participant about what they thought they were trying to do. They sort of add, I guess, the teacher's voice to the program, which is in fairly sterile sort of terms. There's also a little legend that says 1, 2, 3, and that was saying how the teachers use them. Did they use them? Some used them particularly, I guess, to emphasise the visual literacy. So as a format study, they were looking, very closely at the codes and conventions. Others were using it as an area of study. I'm not quite sure what the Queensland. We have areas of study in New South Wales, so if it was something, for example, one of our areas of study might be belonging, so they were using something like shorthand's The Arrival to consider that particular area of study. I guess you call it a concept study. Thomas in here was using it to study war literature, so the concept of war. And then a close study, so looking at a particular version of a text. Sometimes they worked with the graphic novel and the print text alongside each other and sort of looked at how using, I guess this slips into your cultural literacy then, about what was the advantage or the disadvantage of using the graphic novel version, what was it trying to portray and so forth. David in here used Persepolis. He was looking at he was doing the International Baccalaureate, and they were looking at personal challenge and human ingenuity. And so he actually used Persepolis. Do you know Persepolis at all? Yeah. Great graphic novel. But he used that to sort of see why Marianne Satrapi actually used the sort of an illustrated style rather than written text to portray her sort of, her story, and a part of the human ingenuity of using the graphic novel over a print text. So that was, again, a bit like the games, you're really pushing students into that critical and cultural thinking. Okay, so I guess that pushes me into the splits. Oh, sometimes, yep, she's clicking. Yeah. There is a lot of research about the benefits of using graphic novels in the classroom, and when I wanted to extend my interest in them, I'd done some action research on graphic novels, and I really wanted to pursue this in the research area. And I kept reading some of the books here on graphic novels, and they all, and nearly every article you pick up these days, has some sort of caveat at the front about, teachers are hesitant to use them, or it's a very risky business, And so that was one of the things I thought we need to, how do we change this? I guess I could talk to the people who don't use them and say, well, why aren't you? But that's really of no benefit to us here. So I thought I want to look at people who are using them and share their experiences, and, as I say, not try to generalise, but hoping that, well, you could resonate with what they're saying, oh, well, it worked for them, and maybe, if I did it, it could work for me as well. So that was the first thing. The other one was, this was a colleague of mine in the English department, and I was working in the library one day, and I overheard her say this to a group of boys. Okay, that's not her class. We have progressed a little bit of far beyond, some of the antique furniture and stuff there. So she became a bit of a project of mine. I sort of would grab her at every opportunity and say, and show her things like Persepolis, and she saw the value in some of the individual ones. She said, oh, yeah. Now, I might add, she's also organises the film club, so I thought, oh, well, she should be sympathetic to this use of visual text. But no, to this day, she hasn't changed her mind. She's adamant that, they're not intellectually challenging, and they just don't have a place in her particular classroom. So that really, I guess, did make me angry, and I thought, I'm going to do some doctoral research, and I'm going to find out. So I'm now 5.5 years in, and every day I think about that, just keeps me going. So look, these are the teachers who were part of my study. There were 9 English teachers. I don't expect you to read. What I'm trying to do, as you can see, I'm trying to actually incorporate a little bit of comics art into my thesis. Hopefully that will work. There is some guy who's doing a PhD on comics, and he's written the whole thesis as a comic. you know, as a comic book or a graphic novel. I think, wow, that would just be incredible. They varied in the schools they taught in. We had some in co-ed schools, some in boys' schools, some in girls' schools. We had government representatives from government and non-government schools there as well. They were certainly varied in their professional experiences. So they were what we called early career teachers. They were very experienced classroom teachers, some 20 years or so, and then we had some head teachers. And in terms of their, their experience in the classroom with graphic novels, none of them had actually used a graphic novel before as like a standalone text. They generally used them in some sort of supplementary role prior to that. So what they were doing was they were going to teach a graphic novel unit. I spoke to them beforehand, and then I spoke to them afterwards. So there were 2 interviews with them. In terms of their life world experiences, as I said before, there were some who were raised on comic books, and continued to be very passionate about the format. There were others who had only had that professional contact, but people I spoke to, and of course these people volunteered, so it's not likely that I was going to talk to them and they were going to say, oh God, I hate the things, but given that 6 of them were mandated to teach graphic novels, so they weren't all doing it, and 3 actually had chosen to. One of them said, look, it's just not in my DNA at all. So he's, he's just saying, I can walk in and I can teach an English lesson on Jane Austen or whatever, but give me graphic novels. And he described himself as the L plater, which I thought was a great thing. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that changed the whole dynamics of the classroom. And then there was another teacher who said, I've never seen one before I got here. I didn't know how to read one. I had to get a friend to tell me. And this poor teacher, I felt so sorry for her because she'd just been given a task by her head teacher to design a graphic novel unit for the whole of Year 10. And, think that, any text that you had no idea about and suddenly given this rather giant task. All the units they were teaching were from Years 7 to 10. I certainly I didn't put that limit on it. I was happy for them to be 7 to 12. But one of the things they said, and this relates back to teaching with graphic novels, I guess they said, they did identify explicitly, some of them, that they did feel they were taking a risk, that in the senior school they couldn't afford to take that risk with the current constraints of assessment and time, etc., to get through things. So they talked about, the narrow prescriptive curriculum, and I guess that's why it's important to hear from teachers, because it's all very well to have this wonderful theory of why we should do it, but when it gets into that messiness of the classroom, there are other things acting upon it, cultural, organisational restraints. So that leads us into these challenges, some of which I've already talked about. So some of them felt inadequate, uncomfortable in the classroom because they just didn't have that meta-language to go into the deeper questions. They all felt a lack of support at an organisational level. None of them, even the younger teachers, had had any explicit training in how to teach these sorts of visual texts in particular. Curriculum, they felt there wasn't a lot of formal curriculum support documents, and just that mention, as I said earlier, the lack of mention in the curriculum documents, which sent some sort of message, they felt sent a message to teachers that perhaps there are better ways of doing what you're trying to do. And then the professional development. At the local level, so within their own classrooms, within their own school and with their own parent communities, they also felt that they were out on a bit of a limit times. They weren't really surprised that their colleagues weren't on board, but they were surprised about students because they'd gone into the classroom almost with an expectation that this was something the students would know about. All I need to do is to give them sort of, prize it out of them and give them that language to articulate it. But as it turned out, that assumption was not quite right, that there were a lot of students who weren't familiar. And I guess it's like, I really don't like that term digital natives for the same thing. They're not all digital natives. So we have to be careful about the assumptions we make about the texts and really know our individual students. The parents The parents that they talked about weren't against the idea. It was, again, they just didn't have the information to make a sort of a reasonable, or an educated judgment, if you like to say, about the text. And they said they'd go to parent-teacher nights, they'd take the texts, they'd talk about them, what they were going to do with them, and the parents were on board once they understood what was happening. And then, of course, the organisational constraints. I'm sure we're all familiar with those. Time is always going to kill us. That messiness of Year 7 have gone off to the museum today, and I'm one less lesson down, or I've got one less lesson. All of them had sort of inbuilt into their programs some element of creating for the students. So it's like a performance of understanding of what they were learning. A lot of them didn't get there. They just said time got the better of me. There weren't kids there and all sorts of things. So they really found that was a constraint on what they were doing. Okay. But of course the challenges, fortunately, were, I guess, less than the wonderful positive results these teachers felt. And they all indicated that, yes, they were certainly going to be using graphic novels in the future. Some of them wanted to expand that use into other levels. The ones that, there were some determined to put them into the senior school, but they did say, I can't do that till I have a greater grasp of this meta language. So they were really looking for outlets to improve that. So if I can just run, you don't have to read all of those. Some of to summarise, I guess, some of those highlights, you've got certainly the student engagement. So they did point out, and I nearly asked the question this morning, Catherine, that they did sort of talk about that fine line between pulling in life world interests and then destroying it by, analysing it to death. So they said it's a very, one fellow particularly talked about a fine line on walking so that I don't actually kill something they really like. But they did find that the graphic novels engaged the students. One participant talked about, it was like, she laid the graphic novels out. Just giving the kids time to read, two of them found was really great. They talked about the quietest lesson I've ever had. The kids just sat there totally immersed in these graphic novels. But she said it was like, seagulls to a hot chip. You put these hot chips out and they all... Student engagement in English in general as a subject. A couple of the participants talked about, being in boys' schools, and they found the boys, weren't really engaged in English. That was a girls' sort of thing. And so they found that sort of generated an interest in the subject. A couple of teachers were in a selective school. Do you have selective schools here? Yeah. And she said, the students there tend to be driven in the maths and science and all those sorts of things, but this actually engaged them in English because she felt previously English was sort of sitting below in terms of value for the students, but they felt that this raised the status of English. Certainly there was evidence of the development used, that the graphic novels did achieve the purposes for which they were used, the development of visual, critical and cultural literacies. Michael talked about this, the empowerment of students not normally in the limelight. And I just wanted to read, don't change the thing when I I'll just read this from one of the participants. This was David, he was teaching in a girls' school. What I like about teaching graphic novels is that a lot of the kiddies who might have remained silent find they can have a voice because this is a medium that engages them in a whole new way. It gives them the opportunity to hold the spotlight for a while. Because they're talking about something that they have a passion for, they often articulate themselves with a great deal of vibrancy. It gives credibility that their reading pattern all of a sudden has meaning beyond their own little circle of friends. If it appears on the program, it's almost like we've recognised that it has status, that it's worthwhile examining, and there's literary merit there, and it's worthwhile unpicking. That's really liberating for them, and it's also really liberating for the girls who otherwise might own the conversation because they're good novel readers. All of a sudden they have to defer to somebody who might know more than them. It's good for the dynamics of the class. We share or indulge in a range of stuff. So obviously, it's not really, I guess, the graphic novel per se, but it's having something that the kids can connect with. Empowerment of teachers. couple of the early career teachers who did have an interest in graphic novels felt that this was really the only unit that they were teaching that they actually felt quite comfortable in. Even though they said, I still am not confident with that meta language, this is something I know about. I feel as though I've got some control in my classroom, which was really lovely to hear. The disappointing thing, I suppose, was that I asked them then, do the other teachers, who are less comfortable, do they come and speak to you, etc.? No, they don't, because one explicitly said, why would they come to me? I'm considered a new teacher and I have nothing to offer. So there's a bit of a message in there, isn't there? David talked about the changed classroom dynamics. So not only between students, he was also the one who called himself an L-plater. And this ranged right across the participants, that they all have this open attitude and a flexible attitude to teaching, that they are not sort of the font of all knowledge, and that they had other people in the room who were experts, and they were willing to sort of sit back and let the students teach each other and teach the teacher as well. So that was really interesting there. So just to wrap up, I guess, what are some of the takeaways about these teachers' experiences? I guess certainly that my participants all recognised the visual nature of the communication landscape, how important visual texts were, and related to that they had a responsibility as teachers to actually equip students with the ability to navigate that particular landscape. They had a broad notion of literacy beyond, traditional reading and writing, to incorporate all sorts of different texts. And they also had a broad notion of literature. So often, I guess the term literature is associated with sort of what we might call high culture texts, but they include, web pages, all sorts of things in their views of literature. They valued the ability of graphic novels to address a number of literacies, so to facilitate multi-literacies. The teachers were innovative in that, okay, I've got a curriculum, I could just put in picture books and I could study film, but I'm actually going to try something new. They wanted to do something they thought would engage the students. And they were proactive in seeking out their professional development for that. I forgot to mention, most of the professional development they were getting was self-driven. So they were getting it through Twitter, they were getting it online, they were bumping, there was a lot of on-the-fly professional development, over the coffee machine or just bumping into people in the corridors and things. So it wasn't sort of, I guess, from formally arranged sources. They identified themselves as taking a risk. They were using graphic novels, and they did appreciate that some of their colleagues may look down upon their decision. And as I just said, they were certainly flexible in their attitude to teaching them and their position within the classroom. So, we've got a few more. No, I've done that. Okay, I've given you a sheet with some recommendations of graphic novels that have been written by Australian creators. There's a bit of synopsis there. For some of them, I've included places where there are some resources. Just a particular mention, Ubi's Underdogs, which is on the back of the sheet. Brenton McKenna is the first Indigenous graphic novelist to be published. He's not the first Indigenous graphic novelist. Or maybe you could say the Indigenous people 40,000 years ago were the first. But he's actually published those, and it's probably lower level, years 7 and 8. They're fairly simple illustrations, etc. Not, doesn't go into great depth in using all those codes and conventions that are mentioned. So it takes a fairly sort of I can't even think of the word I'm trying to find, but simple format. But it's set in the late 1940s up in Broome. You've got the Chinese pearl divers, the Indigenous people, so it's a nice sort of way to look at, I guess, cultural or identity and so forth. The Nellie Gant, primary based, again, you've got that sort of cultural intersections down on the Victorian goldfields, and if you were teaching history, that would bleed into that nicely. Blue by Pat Grant. Has anyone had a look at that? Mm-hmm. Pat Grant happened to be at Cronulla Beach on Australia Day in, I'll tell you the year when they had the Cronulla riots, that became very nasty. and that really is the inspiration behind this. So it's a great sort of reflection on racism and what's happening there. So interesting. And then just the last slide. I think she says it all, really.
Yeah.
Most people are hesitant about undertaking any new text, but it's like the opera. You need to go a few times to enjoy it. So, any questions? We've got 10 minutes, so, but we can finish early. We'll have a little break.
Got a couple. Sorry, I'm probably going to be that annoying kid at the front of the class.
No.
My question was particularly with Persepolis because I love the novel, but I'm reluctant to use it in class because of some of the content. Do you know whether the teachers used an abridged version or sections of it to avoid some of those more controversial issues in the story?
Persepolis, if you're not familiar with it, is the story of Marianne's Trappy's. It's her autobiography of growing up in Iran in the 1976 revolution. It's a great book to look at, I guess, political things, the position of women. You know, some of the on the first page, there's a stunning visual of she's on the end of this row in the class photo and she's sort of cut in half, you know, and you could, you know, talk about that. It's in black and white. What's that saying about what comment is she making about the regime and things like that? Are you talking about the gender issues, or are you talking about there is some violence?
I'm talking about gender violence and her, and it might come from the context of students I teach, her, I guess, westernisation and some of the more liberal attitudes she takes with drugs and those sorts of things. So,
the teacher, and I know, let's say I know 2 or 3 teachers who have used it, and they've used just the whole
in its
text.
entirety. Okay, I guess
they tend to dwell for, you know, due to time constraints on the first. It was written in 2 parts. You can get the 2 parts together, but the first one was actually.
Yeah.
They tend to do the first one.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and probably so they don't get into more of that.
Those. Yeah.
David, who did Persepolis, actually talked about the violence of what happened to people, you know, during the change of regime, and he said how interesting he hadn't deliberately made it a focal point, but he came up amongst the girls and he said it was interesting because they see this sort of violence every day, realistically, on the TV, but they were struck by the way she presented it in the graphic novel, and it became quite a talking point amongst the girls. So that was an unexpected, I guess, highlight that he came across. So I guess I haven't really answered your question, but
no, you have actually, because it's probably
I think most of the bits you're talking are probably more in the second.
And they are in the second half, and
you did go on to say in their own time the girls went on to read the second part. I mean, that's evidence of engagement as well, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so that was my question. Does anyone else?
I'll let everyone else have a go first. Okay, and I was going to ask about assessment. You mentioned they talked about doing creation for assessment. Was there any other types of assessment they used to sort of get the students to apply their knowledge? Because that seems to be an incredibly time-heavy assessment when there are possibly other ways that they could apply what they've learned.
Certainly there were your traditional, very good hint, isn't it? There were certainly what we might call traditional written assessments about the use of technique, you know, why did they use this particular format to convey that particular story. Yeah, so whether the kids had to actually articulate through the use of the meta-language how it conveyed meaning, that sort of thing. So there was quite a bit of that.
I thought that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. So I was very interested when you talked at the beginning about how people are very wary of using these senior forms. In Victoria this year, the mouse is actually on the list for the year 12 English, and the kind of the part of the process that led up to that was them changing the category film to the category multimodal to enable that to go on. And I was a little bit involved with that and wrote a piece in that online journal, The Conversation. I don't know if people know that.
Yes.
So, and there was a bit of a rationale as to why it might be considered as literature. And then there's quite a long chain of comments. So if people wanted to look at what the arguments that were made and how people did it, they could have a look at mouse in the conversation.
And mouse would probably, I've done a sort of couple with our, I mean, there are some senior students using it, and they tend to use it in year 11, not the final assessment, but often they do choose mouse because there's just so much in there, you know, the literary and the sort of the graphic, the format study as well. So if you would, I guess if you wanted to pick one to start with in the senior years, that's a great example. And there's probably, I'd imagine, you know, if you went to your Victorian curriculum, there'd be support materials and all sorts of things. Look up mouse on the internet, you know, teacher resources, and you'll just be flooded. Thanks for highlighting it. Okay.
Well, if no one else is going to ask a question, I will. It's kind of related in the sense that I think my question's about the selection of graphic novels, and I think what we've noticed in our project is that there's this kind of, you know, one of the things that arises when you start talking about bringing any kind of popular culture into the classroom is, well, what kinds of examples do you bring in? You know, what's the value of the text, if you like? And so in our project, you know, initial conversations are about, well, what's a good quality game, you know, or what's the game that's going to best help my students learn, and so on. So I see that there are probably similar kinds of issues that come up with selection of graphic novels. And so I guess just wondered if you could comment on that a little bit. Is there a kind of canon now emerging of graphic novels? Or?
Well, don't actually. There are actually two very big volumes now called the Graphic Novel Canon. I thought, oh, this sounds fabulous, and they were, you know, they're adaptations of Milton and all sorts of things. I got a copy for the school library, and it's now on my shelf of do not put these out on the bookshelves. I have a few of those. I work in a, you know, religiously affiliated school, so I recognise that despite, well, I don't want to censor things, I also need my job. So I have a few that are just sitting there thinking, no, they just can't go out there. So, for example, I wouldn't put that into a classroom, but one of the reasons I guess I've got this Scoop It, which is like a curation site. I try and, you know, pull things in from the internet and things that are places of review. In America especially, you've got the American Library Association has lists of, you know, by grade level and things of recommendations. But I think it's like, you know, most English teachers and most teachers have been raised with print literature, so once you're asked to try and choose something with which you're not familiar with, you really are having to rely on those who know a bit more about them to, you know, and it's the same as you say, computer games and things that you certainly don't want to find out the first time that it's inappropriate when it's in the middle of year 7 or something like that.
Well, yeah, I think my question relates to what then happens with the text in the classroom. You know, so sure you can analyse the text to see how it's communicating and so on, but I guess I'd be interested to know if there are other ways in which graphic novels are being employed to have the students, you know, use as a jumping off point for writing, or were they encouraged to create their own graphic novels and so on?
Both of those. Make movies, you know, make a movie version of the graphic novel. So using sort of, again, the visual mode to circulation. One thing and we're nearly out of time, if you wanted to go into them and sort of have a look at budget, or you really don't want to put money out without feeling confident about doing, there are so many fantastic, you can get them on the web. So there's classical comics, for example. If you want to just look at an adaptation of Shakespeare, for example, you can download the whole of the first, not chapter, act of Macbeth as a PDF. So you can do these things online, sort of dip in and dive before you actually commit, or if you haven't actually got the money anymore. So there are some great web. So,
I was just going to see if you could comment about this. We use graphic novels sometimes. The Canon's Great Expectations, particularly for consolidation of students if we're looking at differentiation in the classroom. So what's your comment about using that? Because that obviously implies that it's something a bit simpler, or, you know, more simple, I guess, for the students. And what do you think about using it in that way?
I think it's great that it can certainly benefit that understanding. I would like to think that they're both presented as this is one way it can be presented and this is the other, and that as much as you were going to the literary techniques in the print text, you were going to the techniques that are used in the visual text, and then look at them together and say, what does this achieve? What does this achieve? Why is the use of the different mediums? You know, what is the effect of that? Rather than just say, I'm just using this one to help you understand this one, because that does privilege the print and the
Yeah, and then it's a hard sell if you're trying to use it as a unit.
I know that I'm doing graphic novels at school with very little support, financial and from others, and I've basically been told do it with what we have, so I've turned it into a superhero focus to look at the transition from comic books right through to films and graphic novels, because that's the resources really available, but I'm teaching visual literacy. That's been my explicit instruction to go with it. Yeah.
Okay, look, we better let Kelly
Yeah.
get herself organised. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Di, for